The grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel was a cathedral of golden chandeliers and whispered ambition, a place where the city's most powerful gathered to be seen and to be envied. For Karen C. Murphy, it was more than that. It was proof. Proof that the woman who once fled Port Harcourt with nothing but a suitcase and a shattered sense of self had rebuilt everything from the ashes.
Finalized by the morning.
You simply
She
must
stood among them
try the
tonight,
champagne.
a stunning black woman in a sleeveless white gown that flowed like liquid silk against her deep brown skin, her natural hair swept into an elegant updo that crowned her like royalty. Her sharp features caught the warm candlelight as she smiled, truly smiled, for what felt like the first time in 2 years. She had even allowed herself a glass of champagne. A small rebellion against a man who once dictated whether she was allowed to breathe in his presence. The shift in the room was violent and instant. A ripple of murmurs spread from the ballroom entrance like a shockwave. The air turned bitter, thick with a familiar, suffocating dread. Karen didn't have to turn around to know. Her body knew before her mind did, her shoulders hunched inward, her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass, and the old, paralyzing fear flooded back into her chest like ice water filling her lungs. Bryan Zack had found her. He cut through the crowd like a wrecking ball through glass. A tall, broad-shouldered black man whose expensive dark tuxedo hung on him like a costume he'd stopped caring about. His bow tie dangled loose and undone around his thick neck. The top buttons of his shirt popped open, and the stench of whiskey clung to him like a second skin. He gripped a crystal wine glass carelessly in one massive hand, the red liquid sloshing over the rim as he staggered forward. His eyes bloodshot, possessive, burning with a rage that had festered for months, locked onto Karen like a predator, reclaiming territory. "There she is," Bryan's voice boomed across the ballroom, silencing the string quartet mid-note. "The woman of the hour." He spat the words like venom, his lips curling into a cruel, mocking grin. Karen's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Her voice, the one she had spent 2 years learning to use again, vanished. She was 26 again, trapped in that apartment in Port Harcourt, making herself small, making herself invisible, praying the storm would pass. It didn't pass. Bryan closed the distance in 3 long strides. Before anyone could react, before a single one of the 300 elite guests in their designer gowns and tailored suits could lift a manicured finger, he raised his glass high and hurled the red wine directly onto her chest. The crimson exploded across the pristine white fabric like a wound opening in real time. It bled down her torso, soaking through the silk, spreading in dark, jagged streaks across her left side. The crystal glass dangled loosely from his fingers, still dripping crimson onto the marble floor, and the silence that followed was louder than any sound the ballroom had ever held. Karen flinched violently, her hands flying up instinctively to shield herself not from the wine, but from the blow she had been conditioned to expect next. Her eyes were wide, glistening, filled with the kind of distress that goes beyond embarrassment. It was the look of a woman watching her carefully constructed new life collapse in a single, public moment. "You thought you could run from me?" Bryan leaned into her space, his massive frame towering over her, his jaw tight with entitled fury. "You thought you could play dress-up with these people and pretend you're somebody?" Around them, the world froze. Waiters stood rigid, with trays still balanced on their palms. Women clutched their pearls. Men in $1,000 suits suddenly found the bottoms of their whiskey glasses deeply fascinating. 300 of the most influential people in the city, and not a single one moved. But someone was watching. 2 tables away, slightly in the foreground of the chaos, a man sat alone with the stillness of a loaded weapon. Gyo Hak-Kun didn't flinch. He didn't gasp. He didn't reach for his phone like the others. He simply watched an Asian man with sleek, dark hair, parted with surgical precision. Not a single strand displaced, despite the tension crackling through the room. His tailored dark navy blue suit fit him like armor, the crisp white shirt beneath it sharp enough to cut, a dark tie knotted with the kind of exactness that suggested Everything this man did was deliberate. His posture was immaculate. Spine straight, shoulders squared, jaw set like carved stone. His expression was utterly cold. Not angry, not shocked. Something far more dangerous. Focused. Slowly, without breaking his gaze from Brian's back, Gyo Hak-Kun raised his left wrist. His fingers steady, unhurried, precise, found the clasp of the heavy gold luxury watch that gleamed against his skin. The metallic click of the buckle releasing cut through the ballroom's stunned silence like a blade being drawn from its sheath. He placed the watch gently on the white tablecloth beside his untouched glass of water. And then he stood. If you want to see what happens when a man who controls the city's shadows decides that the bully in the room just made the last mistake of his life, stay until the very end. Because what Gyo Hak-Kun did next didn't just rescue Karen C. Murphy. It began the complete and total erasure of Bryan Zack from existence. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. Now, let's dive into the story. Gyo Hak-Kun moved the way gravity moves, inevitable, silent, and impossible to resist. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He simply rose from his chair, with the fluid precision of a man who had ended far more dangerous situations than this, with far less effort. The gold watch lay on the tablecloth behind him like a discarded crown, and without it, his left wrist looked bare and deliberate, a fighter, clearing his tools before work. Every step he took toward Brian, Zack carried the weight of absolute certainty, not the clumsy certainty of ego. The cold, mechanical certainty of a man who had already calculated exactly how this would end. Brian didn't notice him. Of course he didn't. Brian was too busy feeding on Karen's terror, too drunk on the power of watching her shrink beneath him. He was leaning further into her space now, one thick finger jabbing the air inches from her face. His voice, a serrated whisper, meant only for her. You're nothing without me, Karen. You hear me? Nothing. You think a fancy dress and a room full of rich people changes what you are? Karen's lips trembled, but no sound came out. The wine stain bled deeper into the white silk, and her hands remained frozen in that instinctive, defensive posture. Palms up, fingers slightly curled. The muscle memory of a woman who had learned to make herself a smaller target. The old programming had taken over completely. She wasn't in the Meridian Hotel ballroom anymore. She was back in that apartment, back in that darkness. Excuse me. The voice came from directly behind Brian, and it was so calm, so conversational, that it might have been a man politely asking to pass in a crowded hallway. Brian spun around, irritation flashing across his face at the interruption. Gyo Hak-Kun stood there, shorter than Brian by several inches, leaner by 40 pounds. But the difference between them in that moment was the difference between a bonfire and a blade. One was loud, reckless, and consumed everything it touched. The other was precise, silent, and designed to cut exactly where it intended. Who the hell are you? Brian snarled, his bloodshot eyes raking over Gyo's immaculate navy suit with the dismissive contempt of a man who measured threat only in physical size. Gyo didn't answer. He didn't need to. His dark eyes held Brian's gaze with the flat, unblinking focus of a predator that had already chosen its moment. Then he moved. It happened so fast that the gasps from the crowd came a full second after it was already over. Gyo's left hand shot forward and seized Brian's right wrist, the one still gripping the wineglass, and twisted it inward with a sharp, mechanical rotation. The crystal glass finally shattered against the marble, exploding into glittering fragments across the floor. In the same fluid motion, Gyo stepped to the side, wrenched Brian's arm behind his back, and locked the elbow joint at an angle that the human body was never designed to reach. Brian's knees buckled instantly. A strangled, animal sound ripped from his throat as the pain short-circuited every ounce of his drunken bravado. The entire maneuver took less than 2 seconds. Not a single crease appeared in Gyo's suit. Brian tried to struggle, tried to wrench free, but Guio applied a fraction more pressure to the joint, and Brian's entire body went rigid, his face contorting in agony. He was bent forward at the waist now, his free hand slapping uselessly against his own thigh. His jaw clenched so hard, the veins in his neck bulged like cables. Guio leaned down, close, his lips nearly touching Brian's ear, and he whispered something. No one in the ballroom heard it, not the frozen waiters, not the 300 silent guests, not the security team that had finally appeared at the edges of the room, only to stop dead when they recognized the man in the navy suit. Not even Karen, who stood barely 3 feet away, trembling, mascara-streaked tears, cutting silent paths down her cheeks. But whatever Guio whispered, it drained every remaining ounce of color from Bryan Zack's face. His eyes went wide, not with pain anymore, but with something deeper. Something that looked, for the first time in his miserable life, like genuine fear. Guio released him. Brian staggered forward, clutching his arm against his chest like a wounded animal. He opened his mouth as if to speak, to threaten, to salvage some scrap of the dominance he had walked in with, but the words died before they reached his lips. He looked at Guio. Then he looked at the room full of people who had just watched him. The man who prided himself on being untouchable get folded like paper by a stranger who hadn't even raised his voice. Brian stumbled backward. Then he turned and pushed through the crowd toward the exit, knocking a chair sideways as he went. The ballroom remained deathly silent. Guio straightened his cuffs. A small, barely perceptible adjustment, the kind of motion a man makes when the disruption he just handled barely registered as an inconvenience. Then he turned to Karen. She was still frozen. Her arms were still raised in that heartbreaking defensive posture, her body still braced for a blow that was no longer coming. The wine stain had spread to nearly her entire left side now, the dark crimson stark and ugly against the ruined white silk. Guio didn't touch her. He didn't reach for her hand or place a reassuring palm on her shoulder the way a lesser man might have, thinking comfort required contact. Instead, he simply positioned himself between her and the rest of the room, between her and their stares, their whispers, their phones, and spoke in a voice that was low, even, and meant only for her. You don't have to stand here anymore. I have a car outside. You'll be safe. Karen blinked. The word safe hit her like a physical thing, cracking through the shell of paralysis that had locked her body in place. She looked up at him at the sharp lines of his jaw, the flat calm of his dark eyes, the absolute absence of pity in his expression. He wasn't looking at her like she was broken. He wasn't looking at her with the wide-eyed, useless sympathy of the 300 people who had watched her get humiliated and done nothing. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a situation he has already decided to handle. She nodded. It was small, shaky, barely a movement at all, but it was enough. Guio turned and walked toward the ballroom's private side exit, and Karen followed. She didn't know why. Everything in her rational mind was screaming that she didn't know this man, that following a stranger out of a building was the opposite of safe. But something deeper than rationality, something primal, something that recognized the difference between a man who wanted to control her and a man who was simply clearing the path, told her to move. As they stepped into the corridor, Guio raised his left hand and made a small, almost imperceptible gesture. 2 men materialized from opposite ends of the hallway, as if they had been woven into the walls themselves. Both were dressed in dark suits. Both moved with the same quiet, disciplined efficiency as their boss. No words were exchanged. One of the men fell into step ahead of them. The other took position behind. The formation was instinctive, practiced, seamless. Outside, the night air hit Karen's damp skin, and she shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself. A black sedan was already idling at the curb, its engine a low, patient hum. One of Guio's men opened the rear door. Guio stopped and turned to her. My driver will take you home. 2 of my people will secure your building tonight. You won't see them, but they'll be there." He paused, and for the first time, something shifted behind his eyes. Not warmth exactly, but a recognition. An acknowledgement of what she had just survived. "No one is coming near you again. Not tonight. Not after tonight." Karen opened her mouth to ask who he was, why he was doing this, what any of this meant. But the questions tangled in her throat, caught between exhaustion and the overwhelming, unfamiliar sensation of someone else carrying the weight. So instead she whispered, "Thank you," and climbed into the car. Guio closed the door himself. Then he stood on the curb and watched the sedan pull away until its taillights vanished into the city's restless glow. He turned to the man standing at his shoulder. "I want everything on Bryan Zack on my desk by morning. Everything. Financial records, business partners, property holdings, and find out how he knew she would be here tonight." The man nodded once and disappeared. Guio stood alone in the night air for a long moment, his bare left wrist pale under the streetlight where the gold watch used to sit. Then he straightened his tie and walked back inside. Karen didn't remember the drive home. She didn't remember walking through her lobby or riding the elevator to the 14th floor. She remembered standing in her bathroom, staring at her reflection at the ruined dress, the mascara-streaked face, the woman who looked exactly the way she had looked 2 years ago when she had finally found the courage to leave. She peeled the stained gown off like shedding a second skin and left it in a heap on the tile floor. She stood under the shower until the water ran cold. She expected the nightmares. She expected to lie in the dark with her heart hammering, flinching at every creak of the building, replaying Brian's voice on a sickening loop, the way she had for months after she first escaped. She braced herself for the crushing, familiar weight of anxiety to settle over her chest like a stone. It never came. She lay in the darkness and waited for the fear, but the apartment was impossibly still. The usual sounds that triggered her hypervigilance, the hum of the elevator, footsteps in the hallway, the rattle of the pipes were all there, but they passed through her without catching. Something had changed in the architecture of her nervous system, and she couldn't name it, couldn't explain it. She only knew that for the first time in 2 years, she fell asleep without checking the locks twice, without pushing a chair against the door, without keeping her phone clutched in her fist, with the emergency number already dialed. She slept deeply, and she did not dream. When she woke, pale morning light was filtering through the curtains. She reached for her phone out of habit and froze. There were no frantic texts from Brian, no missed calls from unknown numbers, no voicemails filled with slurred threats and desperate, possessive apologies. The screen was clean, silent. She pulled on a robe and padded to the kitchen to make coffee. It was only when she passed the living room window that she noticed the black sedan parked across the street. It was the same one from last night. A man in a dark suit sat behind the wheel, still and patient, a paper coffee cup resting on the dashboard. Karen stared at the car for a long time. Then she looked down at the lobby entrance and saw a second man standing near the doorway, hands clasped in front of him, positioned with the casual authority of someone who belonged there. The doorman was giving him a wide, respectful berth. She should have been frightened. A stranger's men stationed outside her home, watching her building by every rational measure. That should have sent her spiraling. But the feeling that settled into her chest wasn't fear. It was the opposite. It was the peculiar, almost disorienting sensation of realizing that the fist she had been clenching inside herself for 2 years had finally, slowly, begun to unclench. She made her coffee, she sat by the window, and she breathed. Across the city, in a penthouse suite that reeked of stale whiskey and shattered ego, Bryan Zack was not breathing easily. His right arm throbbed from shoulder to fingertip, a deep, grinding ache that no amount of ice or ibuprofen could touch. The joint lock that the stranger in the navy suit had applied wasn't just painful, it was educational. It was the kind of hold that told you, without words, that the person applying it could have gone much further and had chosen, deliberately, not to. Brian paced the length of his living room, his phone pressed to his ear with his left hand, his jaw working furiously. He had already called 4 people: Marcus Webb, his corporate attorney; Denton Cole, his business partner at the consulting firm; 2 other men associates who operated in the gray spaces between legitimate business and the kind of favors that didn't come with receipts. "I don't care who he is," Brian hissed into the phone. "Some Asian guy in a suit thinks he can put his hands on me in front of the entire city? Find out his name. Find out what he's worth. Find out where he's vulnerable." He ended the call and hurled his phone onto the leather sofa. His reflection stared back at him from the floor-to-ceiling windows, bow tie still hanging loose, shirt still half open, the same disheveled state he'd stumbled home in. He hadn't changed, hadn't showered. The humiliation was still too fresh, too raw, burning in his chest like acid. Bryan Zack had spent his entire adult life cultivating an image of invulnerability. He was the man you didn't cross, the man whose handshake could launch a career or end one. The man who had kept a woman trapped for 3 years through nothing but the sheer gravitational force of his rage. And in 2 seconds, 2 impossibly fast, impossibly precise seconds, a stranger had unmade all of it in front of an audience. By noon, Marcus Webb called back. "His name is Gyo Hak-Kun, Korean national, but he's been based here for years. Business interests in real estate, import-export, some tech holdings. Rich, but relatively low profile. No criminal record. No political connections that I can find." Brian felt a smile creep across his swollen face. Rich, but low profile. No political connections. That meant no protection. That meant the man was just money without muscle. A businessman who had gotten lucky with one fancy move and was now operating way outside his depth. "Good," Brian said, cracking the knuckles of his uninjured hand. "Set up a meeting with Denton. We're going to make this guy regret the day he touched me." It was the most catastrophically wrong assessment Bryan Zack had ever made in his life. And he had no idea, not even the faintest whisper of a clue, that the man he was preparing to threaten owned the shadows that his entire world was built on. 3 days later, Karen sat across from Guio Hakun at a corner table in a small, quiet restaurant that she was fairly certain didn't appear on any public listing. The windows were frosted, the lighting was soft and amber, and the only other patrons were 2 elderly men playing chess near the bar, who seemed entirely unbothered by the 2 suited men positioned at the restaurant's entrance. Gyo looked exactly as he had at the banquet, impeccably composed, his dark navy suit pressed to geometric perfection, every strand of his sleek black hair in its designated place. The only difference was the absence of the gold watch on his left wrist. The bare skin there seemed almost intentional, like a soldier who had removed a piece of armor and wanted you to notice. Karen had spent 3 days trying to understand what was happening to her. 3 days of waking up without panic. 3 days of walking past the black sedan and the quiet men and feeling not surveilled but sheltered. 3 days of waiting for the catch, the hidden cost, the inevitable moment when this stranger's protection would reveal itself as just another cage. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her coffee untouched, her dark eyes searching his face for the answer his words might try to hide. Guio considered the question the way he seemed to consider everything, with an unhurried, almost meditative stillness. When he spoke, his voice was measured and precise, every word placed with intention. "Mr. Zack's firm manages investment funds for several organizations connected to the charity event where we met. My people have been watching his financials for some time. He has been stealing not small amounts, and not carelessly, but stealing nonetheless. He was already someone I intended to deal with." Karen felt her breath catch. "So the banquet. I was there on business." His presence was unexpected. "Yours was incidental." Gyo paused, and that same subtle shift moved behind his dark eyes, the one she had glimpsed that night on the curb. Not warmth, recognition. But what he did to you in that room was not incidental to me. That changed things. Changed things how? There is a difference between dismantling a man's finances and dismantling his existence. Gyo lifted his teacup and took a small, deliberate sip. When I watched him pour that wine on you, when I watched 300 people do nothing, I decided Mr. Zack would receive the latter. A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, heavy with implication. He's already looking for you, Gyo continued, setting the cup down. His attorney pulled my business records yesterday. He believes I'm a conventional businessman. He can pressure or outspend. He will reach out to his network. He will make threats. He will escalate. The faintest trace of something that might have been amusement crossed Gyo's features, gone as quickly as it appeared. I want you to understand that none of this will touch you. His accounts are already being drained, slowly, methodically, in ways his own accountants won't detect until it is far too late. His business partners are receiving calls this week from people they trust more than him. By the time Bryan Zack realizes what is happening, there will be nothing left to save. Karen stared at him. The woman she had been 2 years ago, the one who had been taught to be grateful, to be quiet, to accept whatever version of reality, the most powerful man in the room, dictated that woman would have been terrified by what Gyo was describing. But the woman sitting in this quiet restaurant, 3 days removed from the worst public humiliation of her life, and somehow more at peace than she had been in years, that woman felt something entirely different. She felt the ground beneath her becoming solid. "You don't owe me anything," she said carefully. "No," Gyo agreed. "I don't." He said nothing else. He didn't explain further, or offer reassurances, or fill the silence with promises. He simply returned to his tea, his dark eyes calm and absolute, and let the truth of what he was settle over the table like something permanent. Karen picked up her coffee. It was still warm. She took her first sip, and it tasted like the beginning of something she had never been allowed to have. It started with the small things, the quiet, surgical cuts that a man like Bryan Zack wouldn't notice until he was already bleeding out. The first card declined at a steakhouse on a Tuesday evening. Bryan laughed it off, tossed a second card to the waiter with the casual arrogance of a man who had never once worried about money. That one declined too. He paid cash, told himself it was a bank glitch, and made a mental note to call his financial advisor in the morning. By Thursday, the glitch had metastasized. His primary business account, the one that funded payroll, client dinners, and the monthly lease on his corner office, overlooking the harbor, was frozen. Not empty, frozen. His banker, a man who had personally handled Bryan's portfolio for 6 years and had never once failed to return a call within the hour, was suddenly unreachable. His assistant said he was in meetings. Every time. All day. For 3 consecutive days. Then the partners started disappearing. Denton Cole, his co-founder, stopped answering texts. Marcus Webb, his attorney, sent a single terse email stating that due to an evolving conflict of interest, he could no longer represent Bryan's firm and wished him the best in securing alternative counsel. No explanation, no follow-up. The email had the sterile, pre-written quality of something drafted by a man who had been told, very clearly, to step away. Bryan called 7 people that week. 5 didn't answer. 1 answered and hung up after 11 seconds. The last, a city councilman who owed Bryan 3 favors and a considerable sum of unreported campaign contributions, picked up the phone, listened to Bryan's furious demands for 10 seconds, and said, in a voice that was unnervingly quiet, "Bryan, I'm going to give you the best advice you'll ever receive. Stop calling people. Stop making noise. And whatever you did to upset the people you upset, pray they're the forgiving kind." The line went dead. Bryan stood in his penthouse, the phone pressed against his ear, long after the dial tone replaced the councilman's voice. The city stretched beneath him through the floor-to-ceiling windows, glittering and indifferent. For the first time, the skyline didn't feel like something he owned. It felt like something that was watching him. He didn't understand what was happening. He couldn't trace it, couldn't map it, couldn't find the source. It was like fighting smoke every time he reached for an answer. It dissolved between his fingers. All he knew was that the architecture of his life, the money, the connections, the network of debts and leverage he had spent 15 years constructing, was being dismantled with a speed and precision that felt almost surgical. Like someone had studied the blueprints of his empire and was pulling out the load-bearing walls, one by one, in exactly the right sequence. And somewhere in the wreckage of his unraveling mind, Bryan Zack decided that this, all of it, was Karen's fault. It had to be. The Asian man from the banquet, the frozen accounts, the vanishing allies. It all started the night he had gone to that ballroom to remind Karen who she belonged to. She had done this. She had found some rich benefactor, whispered her lies into his ear, and now they were conspiring to destroy him. That was the only explanation that made sense to a man whose worldview required him to always be the most powerful person in the room. He couldn't get to the man in the navy suit. He didn't know where to find him, didn't know his address, didn't know which of the city's glass towers held his office. But he knew exactly where to find Karen. He tracked her to her corporate building on a Friday evening. He had watched the entrance for 2 hours from across the street, sitting in a rented car, because his own had been quietly repossessed that morning. He waited until the last clusters of employees filtered out into the evening. He waited until the lobby security guard stepped away from the desk to use the restroom. Then he slipped through the side entrance and descended the concrete stairwell into the underground parking garage. The garage was a cavern of gray concrete and fluorescent light, half empty at this hour. The remaining vehicles casting long shadows between the support pillars. Bryan positioned himself behind a concrete column near the elevator bank and waited, his breath ragged, his injured arm still aching with a dull, persistent fire. He heard her heels before he saw her, the sharp, measured click of a woman walking with purpose, her footsteps echoing off the low ceiling. Karen emerged from the elevator with her keys already in her hand, her posture straighter than he had ever seen it, her chin lifted in a way that sent a hot spike of rage through his chest. She was wearing a tailored charcoal blazer and dark trousers, her natural hair pulled back, and she moved with the quiet confidence of a woman who had stopped flinching. That confidence, that unbearable, unforgivable confidence, was the thing that finally broke whatever leash Bryan had left on his self-control. He stepped out from behind the pillar. Karen, she stopped, the keys froze in her hand. For one terrible, suspended moment, the old programming flickered across her face, the widened eyes, the involuntary step backward, the instinctive curl of her shoulders. Bryan saw it, and he smiled. There she was, the real Karen. His Karen. You think you can just erase me? He walked toward her, his voice low and trembling with barely contained fury. His fists were clenched at his sides, the knuckles white. You think your little boyfriend in the suit can make me disappear? I built you, Karen. I made you. And I will tear down every single thing you think you've... That's enough. The voice came from the shadows to Bryan's left, and it stopped him mid-stride, as if he had walked into a wall. It was calm, conversational, and it carried the same terrifying, unhurried authority that had echoed through the ballroom 2 weeks ago. Gyo Hak-Kun stepped into the fluorescent light. He emerged from behind a concrete pillar, as if the shadows had simply released him, his dark navy suit pristine, his posture immaculate, his sleek black hair catching the harsh light without a strand out of place. His left wrist was bare. His hands hung loosely at his sides. Behind him, 2 more figures materialized from the darkness, his men, positioned with the silent, practiced geometry of professionals who had done this many times before. Bryan's face twisted. You think I'm afraid of you? No, Gyo said quietly. Not yet, Brian lunged. It was a clumsy, rage-fueled charge, all weight and fury, and zero precision. The desperate lunge of a man who had spent his life intimidating people with size alone, and had never once faced someone who knew how to dismantle that advantage. Gyo sidestepped the charge with a small, almost dismissive pivot of his hips, letting Brian's momentum carry him forward into empty space. Before Brian could correct his balance, Gyo's right hand shot out and delivered a single, devastating strike to the nerve cluster just below Brian's ear. Brian's legs went liquid. He staggered, his hands clawing at the air. And Gyo followed with a second strike, an open palm, driven into the center of Brian's chest with enough force to send him stumbling backward into the concrete pillar. Brian hit the pillar hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. He tried to push off, tried to raise his fists, but Gyo was already there. A swift, clinical kick to the outside of Brian's left knee buckled him sideways. And before he could recover, Gyo seized his injured right arm, twisted it behind his back, and drove him face first to the concrete floor. Brian screamed. The sound bounced off the garage walls and came back to him, distorted, pathetic, unrecognizable. Gyo pressed one knee into the center of Brian's spine and held him there pinned, gasping, utterly neutralized without a single bead of sweat on his brow. His suit was untouched. His breathing was unchanged. He looked the way a man looks, after buttoning his jacket, not after putting another man on the ground. Karen stood 10 feet away, her keys still in her hand, her chest rising and falling rapidly. But she wasn't cowering. Her shoulders weren't hunched. Her hands weren't raised in that instinctive, heartbreaking shield. She was standing upright, watching the man who had terrorized her for 3 years writhe on cold concrete beneath the knee of someone who had decided, with absolute finality, that Bryan Zack's time was over. Gyo looked up at her. Their eyes met across the garage, and he held her gaze for a long, deliberate moment, not seeking approval, not performing for her benefit, but simply letting her see. Letting her witness, clearly and completely, that the thing she had been afraid of for so long was just a man. Just flesh and bone and ego. And flesh and bone and ego could be put on the ground. Then Gyo leaned down, his lips close to Brian's ear, and this time, he didn't whisper. "You've been stealing, Mr. Zack." Brian's thrashing stopped. His body went rigid beneath Gyo's knee. The Meridian Foundation, the Hargrove Children's Trust, the Eastport Community Fund. Gyo recited the names with the flat, itemized precision of a man reading a ledger. "You have been siphoning money from charities funded by organizations that belong to me, my companies, my money. You have been stealing from me for the better part of 3 years, and you were too arrogant and too careless to realize that every transaction, every offshore transfer, every doctored invoice was being tracked." Brian's face, pressed against the concrete, had gone the color of ash. His mouth moved, but nothing came out. "My presence at that banquet was not an accident," Gyo continued, his voice never rising above the same calm, measured tone. "I was there because the charities you've been bleeding dry are funded through my holding companies. You were already a dead man walking, Mr. Zack. Your accounts, your firm, your reputation. All of it was scheduled for demolition long before you stumbled into that ballroom with a glass of wine and your pathetic need to terrorize a woman who had the courage to leave you." Gyo paused. The silence in the garage was absolute. "But then, I watched you pour that wine on her dress. I watched you stand over her, while 300 people did nothing. And I decided that losing your money and your business wasn't enough." Gyo applied a fraction more pressure to Brian's spine, and Brian let out a choked, involuntary sound. "You're going to lose everything, and you're going to know, for the rest of your miserable, diminished life, that it wasn't business. It was personal." Gyo released him. He stood, straightened his cuffs with that same small, precise adjustment, and stepped back. Brian lay on the concrete, gasping, his face streaked with dust and something that glistened in the fluorescent light. He didn't get up. He didn't try. Guio turned to Karen. "It's over," he said simply, and it was. The erasure of Bryan Zack was completed with the same methodical, invisible precision with which it had begun. By Monday morning, his consulting firm's offices were padlocked. The lease had been terminated by a property management company that, upon closer inspection, was a subsidiary of a holding group registered in Seoul. His personal accounts, already frozen, were seized by federal investigators acting on an anonymous and extraordinarily detailed tip that included transaction records, offshore routing numbers, and enough evidence of charity fraud to guarantee indictment. His penthouse apartment, leveraged against the very accounts that had been drained, was repossessed. His name, which had once commanded deference in boardrooms across the city, became a cautionary tale. Whispered at cocktail parties, the man who had crossed someone he shouldn't have. Though no one could quite agree on who. Bryan Zack did not disappear dramatically. He didn't flee the country or go down in a blaze of defiance. He simply shrank. He became smaller, quieter, less visible, until one day the city realized it had forgotten he existed at all. He was last seen leaving a budget motel on the outskirts of town, carrying a single suitcase. His broad shoulders hunched in a posture that Karen would have recognized intimately, the posture of someone who had finally learned what it felt like to be powerless. Karen didn't watch him go. She didn't need to. 3 weeks after the parking garage, Karen drove through wrought iron gates she had never seen before, up a private road lined with sculpted pines, to a sprawling estate that sat on a hillside overlooking the river. The property was immaculate stone and glass and manicured silence, the kind of home that didn't announce wealth so much as assume it. Guio met her at the entrance. He was dressed more casually than she had ever seen him, a dark cashmere sweater over a white-collared shirt, tailored trousers, no tie. His sleek hair was still perfectly in place, his posture still carrying that same quiet, coiled authority, but something about his expression was different. The ice behind his eyes had thawed not into warmth exactly, but into something more open. Something that allowed her to see, for the first time, the man behind the machinery. They walked through the estate's grounds as the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the stone pathways. He showed her the library, floor-to-ceiling shelves, filled with volumes in Korean, English, and Japanese. He showed her the private courtyard, where a single cherry blossom tree stood in the center of a reflecting pool. He spoke more than he had in all their previous conversations combined, and Karen realized that Gyo Hak-Kun was not a man of few words because he had nothing to say. He was a man of few words because he had spent his entire life in rooms where speaking meant exposing a vulnerability. He was choosing, deliberately and for the first time, to be exposed. They ended up in his study, a wide, dark-paneled room with a view of the river below. Guio walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and removed something that caught the fading light and held it, the gold watch. Karen recognized it instantly. The heavy, gleaming face, the intricate clasp. The same watch she had watched him unbuckle in the ballroom on the worst and best night of her life. Guio held it out to her, resting in his open palm. "In my culture," he said, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it, "a watch is not just a measure of time. It is a promise that time will be given. That presence will be maintained. That the person who receives it will never have to wonder whether they are worth someone's hours." Karen looked at the watch. Then she looked at him. "You took this off the night we met," she said. "I did." "Why?" "Because a watch is a constraint. And what I needed to do that night required no constraints." He paused. "But I kept it. I kept it because I knew, from the moment I saw you standing in that ruined dress refusing to fall, that I would eventually want to give it to someone who deserved every second it represents." Karen felt the tears before she could stop them. Not the terrified, helpless tears of the ballroom, but something entirely different. Something that felt like release. Like the final, permanent unclenching of a fist she had been holding so tight, and for so long, that she had forgotten her hand could open. She reached out and took the watch from his palm. It was heavier than she expected, warm from his skin. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of it, not just the gold and the craftsmanship, but the meaning, the promise. She clasped it around her own left wrist. It was too large, the band loose against her slender arm, but she didn't care. She looked up at Gyo, and for the first time since the night they met, she smiled. Not the cautious, guarded smile of a woman still waiting for the blow. A real smile. Full and unafraid, and luminous. Gyo studied her face with that same quiet, calculating focus, except now, the calculation had softened into something that looked, unmistakably, like reverence. "Welcome to your new empire, Karen," he said. She didn't correct him. She didn't deflect or minimize, or shrink the way she had been trained to do. She simply stood in that dark-paneled room, the gold watch gleaming on her wrist, the river burning copper in the last of the daylight, and let herself be exactly what she was. A woman who had survived. A woman who had been found. A woman who would never cower again. Can the city's most dangerous man protect the woman he just met from the ghost of her past? And what dark secret connects Bryan Zack's stolen millions to the very charities Karen see? Murphy was celebrating that night? Smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you do not want to miss what happens next.